let's talk about something we almost never question. The things we just know are true. You know, the line between sane and insane, lawful and criminal, or even just what we consider normal. Where did those lines actually come from? Well, stick with me because we are about to dive into the work of a philosopher who made it his life's mission to solve that very mystery. This question right here is the key that unlocks everything Michel Foucault was about. It sounds so simple, right? But the answer, as you're about to see, is, well, it's anything but. It really challenges the very ground we're standing on. Now, when you hear philosopher, you might picture some stuffy academic. Forget that. Think of Foucault as a kind of detective, a historical gumshoe. He wasn't here to tell us what the truth is. No, he was all about digging through the archives of history to figure out how we came to believe certain things are true in the first place. He wanted to find the hidden fingerprints on our most basic beliefs. So here's our game plan for following Foucault's investigation. We're going to start with that big question, what is normal? Then we'll look at his two main tools, discourse and power. After that, we'll see how he used those tools to show how the modern self was basically created. And finally, we'll get to the big one, why any of this still matters for us right now.
Okay, so who decides what's normal? Foucault's answer wasn't a secret committee or some powerful person. Nope. For him, the answer was a process, something very deep in history, and to dig it up, he had to invent a whole new set of tools.
The first tool in his kit is something he called archaeology, and honestly, that metaphor is perfect. He wasn't digging for dusty old pots or bones, he was digging through the layers of language, ideas, and habits that have built up over hundreds of years to become what we call knowledge. He was digging for something called discourse. And for Foucault, discourse is way more than just talking. Think of it like the entire operating system for knowledge in a particular time and place. It's the set of invisible rules that determines what you can even talk about, who gets to be an expert, and what gets accepted as the truth. This is why Foucault saw things like a doctor's diagnosis, a judge's ruling, or even a scientific paper, not just as descriptions of reality, but as historical events. Each one was an artifact, a clue that revealed the rules of the discourse at that time. So his method was basically this 4-step dig. First, you pick your site, say madness. Then you gather everything ever said or done about it. That's your archive. The real detective work is step 3, figuring out the unwritten rules of that conversation. And that's when you have the big reveal. You see how a truth like mental illness wasn't just discovered, it was actively built. Now, his second tool builds on the first. If archaeology digs down to find the rules of knowledge, genealogy traces the messy, chaotic family tree of our ideas. It's less about what people knew and much more about the power struggles that brought that knowledge into being. You know, traditional history loves to tell these clean stories of progress, kings and battles leading to our enlightened present. Foucault's genealogy just blows that up. It finds accidents, messy fights, and hidden power grabs. It shows that our modern norms weren't born from some grand, rational plan, but from a whole lot of conflict. And this brings us to what might be Foucault's most mind-bending idea. If our truths are all shaped by these power struggles, then what is this power he's talking about? Is it just the government, the police, the 1%? Foucault's answer was no. It's something much, much bigger. And it's everywhere. Get this, for Foucault, power isn't just something a king has that says, no, you can't do that. It's not just repressive, it's also productive. It's a web that runs through the whole of society, and it actively creates things. It produces knowledge. It produces what we think of as normal. It even produces us, the kinds of people we are. He called this power knowledge because the two are always tangled together. Okay, so that's the toolkit. Archaeology to dig for the rules, and genealogy to trace the power. Now, let's see these tools in action. We're going to look at 3 of Foucault's most famous investigations to see how he uncovered the creation of the modern self, how we became who we are today. Let's start with madness. Foucault showed it wasn't always seen as a medical problem, far from it. In the Middle Ages, it was about exclusion. Later, during the Greek confinement of the 17th century, the mad were just locked up with anyone who didn't want to work. It was about enforcing a new work ethic. It was only in the 19th century that the asylum was invented, and doctors stepped in to rebrand madness as mental illness, something to be studied and cured.
Next up, Foucault turned his gaze to the prison. In his masterpiece, Discipline and Punish, he traced this incredible shift in how societies control people, a shift away from punishing the body and towards reforming the soul.
So think about it. We went from these gruesome public executions, a big, violent spectacle of the king's power, to the modern prison, which works quietly behind walls to discipline the prisoner's mind. The goal wasn't to inflict pain anymore. It was to create docile bodies, people who would constantly monitor and correct themselves. Power became invisible, but in a way, much more effective. And finally, Foucault took on the history of sexuality. And again, he wasn't interested in what people were doing in bed. He wanted to know why our sexual behaviors suddenly became this intense problematization, this huge source of anxiety and supposedly the deepest secret to who we really are. His genealogy showed that sexuality as we think of it is actually a pretty new invention. For the ancient Greeks, it was just about managing your pleasures, a matter of self-control. Then Christianity came along and made it about your innermost desires, something you had to confess to find the truth. And that set the stage for modern science, doctors, psychiatrists, to turn sex into the absolute core of our identity. So, after all this digging through asylums, prisons, and confessionals, what's the big reveal? What's the point of all this detective work for us today? Well, it leads to a revelation that can fundamentally change how you see yourself. At the very heart of Foucault's work is this radical attack on the idea that we have some kind of stable, solid self inside of us. He's showing us that the I we take for granted might not be as fixed as we think. And here it is. This is the big one. We are not born with a pre-packaged identity. Our sense of self, who we believe we are, isn't some natural fact. It is a historical product. We are shaped, molded, and literally made into the people we are by the invisible forces of discourse and power that surround us. Which means all those categories we use to define ourselves and everyone else, sane or mad, criminal or law-abiding, normal or deviant, they aren't things we discover out in the world. They are inventions. They are tools created in history used to classify, manage, and control people. And the coolest thing about Foucault's work is that he hands this toolkit over to us. He's teaching us to be detectives in our own lives. The next time you hear something that just sounds obvious or natural, stop and ask, what are the unwritten rules here? Who benefits from this truth? How is knowledge being used to shape the way I see the world? And that's the question Foucault leaves us with. Because if our deepest truths about who we are were made by history, well, that means they can be unmade. They can be changed. The investigation doesn't stop with him. It starts with you.